The streets were quiet that evening, the kind of peace that only comes with the late hours. A young boy, no older than 12, moved slowly down the sidewalk in his wheelchair. His pace was deliberate, as he had learned to accept the slow rhythm of his life. Every movement required effort, and he had long ago grown accustomed to the struggles that came with his disability. The world seemed to ignore his presence, as if he were just another part of the background. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. The boy was lost in his thoughts when the sudden roar of an engine broke the silence. He looked up just as a police car screeched to a halt beside him, its imposing size taking up the entire street. Inside the car, two officers exchanged words before the driver's gaze lingered on the boy. The officer's eyes narrowed with disdain as he sized him up, a vulnerable child in a wheelchair. To him, the boy was nothing more than an easy target. "Hey kid," the officer barked, his voice sharp and commanding. The boy froze, unsure of what he had done wrong. His heart raced as he looked up at the officer, who stepped out of the car with a sense of authority. "Move it," the officer said with a sneer, walking toward the boy. There was no reason for the aggression, no justification for the harshness in his voice. It was a simple act of bullying, the officer's power over a vulnerable child who couldn't defend himself. The boy didn't move. He felt trapped, unsure of how to respond. He knew that speaking out would only make things worse. But the officer wasn't interested in explanations. He reached out and shoved the wheelchair hard. The force sent the boy's body jerking forward, and he struggled to keep his balance. His heart pounded as the world around him spun out of control. The officer laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "What's the matter, boy? You can't even take a little push?" The boy didn't respond. He couldn't. He just sat there, humiliated as the officer loomed over him. The world around him felt like it was closing in, and the weight of the officer's words made him feel smaller and smaller. But then, from across the street, the boy's father noticed the commotion. He had been walking nearby, and the sudden sight of his son in danger brought a rush of anger through him. He stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing as he saw the officer shove the wheelchair. This wasn't just a random act of cruelty, it was personal. His son was being targeted, and the father wasn't going to let it stand. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a quiet intensity. His face was stern, but there was a fire in his eyes. He was no stranger to conflict. Years of military service had hardened him, sharpening his instincts for moments like this. This wasn't a battlefield, but it was still a fight, one he would not back down from. Without hesitation, he crossed the street, his pace quickening as he approached the scene. The officers hadn't noticed him yet. The first officer was still standing over the boy, mocking him, unaware of the danger approaching. The father reached them in a few long strides, his presence suddenly dominating the scene. The officer turned just as the father spoke, his voice low but carrying a quiet power. "Think it's funny?" His words were calm but full of authority. The officer's smirk faltered, replaced by uncertainty. He wasn't prepared for this. He hadn't expected someone like this to show up. "Stay out of this," the officer spat, his confidence wavering. But the father didn't back down. He took another step forward, his hands clenched into fists. In a flash, he grabbed the officer by the collar and yanked him forward. The officer stumbled, surprised by the strength of the man in front of him. The second officer, seeing things spiral out of control, reached for his radio, but it was already too late. The father twisted the first officer's arm behind his back, pushing him to the ground. The officer grunted, struggling to break free, but the father's grip was unyielding. "You're not in charge here," the father said, his voice cold and unwavering. The officer's defiance crumbled. The second officer stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. His partner was on the ground, and it was clear that this wasn't a situation he could control. He glanced at the father, then back at the boy in the wheelchair. The tension in the air was thick, every breath heavy with the anticipation of what would happen next. The father released the first officer and stepped back. The officer lay on the ground, breathing heavily, humiliated. He hadn't expected the boy's father to be so strong, so resolute. The second officer, seeing that his partner was defeated, finally backed off, his earlier bravado gone. The boy watched in stunned silence. He had never seen his father like this before, a man who was calm and measured, but now a force of nature when his family was threatened. The father had always been there, but in that moment he realized the true depth of his father's strength. He had stepped in when it mattered most, not with rage, but with quiet, controlled power. As the father crouched beside his son, he placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You're safe now." The boy, still processing the events, looked up at his father. "Dad, you saved me?" The father nodded, his expression serious but proud. "I'll always protect you. No one will ever hurt you again." The encounter wasn't over. The officers would likely report the incident, but in that moment, the boy understood something vital. His father had shown him that, even in the face of unfairness, strength and determination could prevail. And though the situation wasn't resolved yet, the boy felt something he hadn't felt before: hope. The silence that followed the confrontation was thick, the air still with the tension of the moment. The boy's father, still kneeling beside his son, was calm, his hands gently adjusting the wheelchair. The two officers, rattled and humiliated, stood frozen. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The officers were no longer in control. The father, calm and commanding, had not only defended his son but had shown them the dangerous mistake they'd made. The first officer, who had been shoved to the ground, was the first to recover. He slowly stood, wiping the dust from his uniform, a growl of frustration escaping his throat. "You shouldn't have done that," he muttered, his voice dripping with both anger and embarrassment. The father didn't flinch. "You're the one who crossed the line," he said, his voice low but full of quiet authority. His eyes locked with the officer's, daring him to respond. Before the officer could retort, the screech of tires echoed down the street. The father's eyes flicked toward the noise, sensing the shift in the air. Something was about to happen. A black SUV appeared, skidding to a halt in front of the police car. 3 figures stepped out, 2 men and a woman. The woman, tall and sharply dressed, immediately took charge. She surveyed the scene, her gaze cold and calculating. She approached the officers with a deliberate stride, her eyes never leaving the father. "Is this the man who caused all the trouble?" she asked, her voice sharp. The first officer, still nursing his bruised pride, nodded. "Yeah, this one's the problem," he muttered, pointing to the father. "He attacked me, unprovoked." The woman's eyes briefly flicked over the father, measuring him. "This isn't over," she said under her breath, almost to herself. Then she turned and walked back to the SUV, her companions following silently. The first officer, now even more rattled, opened his mouth to argue, but the second officer, sensing the shift in power, held him back. They had reached the point where they knew further escalation would have dire consequences. The father, sensing the danger wasn't over, turned to his son. "Let's go," he murmured. The boy, his mind still processing the earlier events, nodded quietly. His father's grip on the wheelchair was firm, guiding them away from the scene. The boy couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. As they moved down the street, the boy felt a gnawing sense of dread. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the earlier encounter settling over him. His father was a rock, but even he couldn't control what was coming next. The officers might have been shaken, but the woman was something else entirely, someone who had come for something bigger. The father's instincts kicked in. He knew they had to get off the street, to get somewhere safe. He turned his head, scanning their surroundings. The tension in the air was suffocating. But just as they rounded the corner, the sound of footsteps behind them made his blood run cold. The woman from the SUV had followed them. Her heels clicked on the pavement as she approached, her gaze fixed on the father. "Excuse me," she called out. The calmness of her voice masked the menace lurking underneath. The father stopped, turning to face her. Every muscle in his body was on high alert. The woman was too close. He had to be ready for anything. She stopped just a few feet away, her eyes never leaving him. "I hope you understand," she said, her voice smooth yet full of threat. "This isn't over. You've made things far more complicated than you realize." Without waiting for him to respond, she turned on her heel and walked back toward the SUV. The father's fists clenched. Something in his gut told him this woman was part of a bigger game. Whatever had just started, whatever this woman represented, wasn't going to end with the confrontation. It was just the beginning. The boy, feeling the weight of the situation, leaned back in his wheelchair, his thoughts clouded with fear and confusion. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process everything that had happened. His father had defended him, but the consequences were far from over. The father looked down at his son, his expression unreadable but full of determination. "We need to stay alert," he said quietly. "This isn't over. We're just getting started." The boy nodded, but a deep, uneasy feeling gnawed at him. The world they knew had shifted. It wasn't just the officers they had to worry about anymore. The woman and whatever she represented were far more dangerous, and whatever they had triggered would lead them down a dark, uncertain path. The road ahead was full of threats they couldn't yet see. And it would take every ounce of the father's military strength and the boy's resilience to survive what was coming. The SUV's engine hummed faintly as the father and son hurried down the street, the chilling silence of the moment pressing on them. Every step seemed measured, deliberate. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. The boy's mind raced with the images of the woman and the officers. Something in the air had changed, and now their world felt like it was slipping through their fingers. The boy's voice was a mere whisper. "Are we safe?" The father didn't respond right away, his eyes scanning the street. He gripped the wheelchair tightly, guiding it with precision. His posture was rigid, every sense alert. "Not yet," he said quietly, his voice steady, like the calm before a storm. "But we will be for now." They reached a quiet side street, and the father quickly scanned the area, sensing an unseen danger. The world was eerily still, the sounds of the city muffled by the growing tension. But then, from behind them, a voice cut through the silence. "Going somewhere?" The woman's voice was smooth, calculated, and as cold as the night air. The father froze, instinctively stepping in front of his son. He didn't have to turn to know who it was. The woman. The boy's heart began to race, a heavy sense of dread creeping up his spine. The father's body was tense, his hands subtly resting near where he had concealed a weapon. The woman, moving with unnerving confidence, appeared from the shadows, her eyes locked on the father. "We don't want any more trouble," the father said, his voice calm but firm, trying to de-escalate the situation. The woman's lips curled into a smirk. "Too late for that," she replied, her tone laced with disdain. You made it personal. Now you're involved. The father's gaze never wavered. I'll protect my son at any cost, he said, his voice low but full of certainty. The woman tilted her head as if studying him. Then, with a sharp nod, she motioned, and two more figures emerged from the shadows. Tall, imposing, they stepped forward with a slow, deliberate pace. They were menacing, their faces hidden behind masks, each movement calculated and controlled. The father's body stiffened. His instincts screamed danger, but he knew he had no choice but to stand his ground. The two masked figures flanked the woman, and it was clear that they weren't just muscle, they were part of something bigger. The father's mind raced. He could handle a fight, but this was different. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was planned. Do you really think you can take all of us on? The woman asked, her voice now dripping with mockery. The father's gaze remained steady. I'll do whatever it takes to protect my son, he replied, his words as sharp as steel. And I'll make sure you don't get another chance. The woman's smile deepened, but it didn't reach her eyes. You're brave, she said. But bravery doesn't change anything. You're already in too deep. The father's fingers curled slightly, gripping the wheelchair. His eyes flicked to the men as they moved closer, trying to surround them. But the woman's words echoed in his mind. You're already in too deep. With a sudden motion, the father's hand darted for the weapon at his side. The masked figures hesitated, momentarily caught off guard. The father was faster, the gun now drawn, aimed directly at the closest man's chest. Stay back, the father warned, his voice cold and unyielding. The masked man froze, his eyes narrowing, clearly weighing his options. The woman raised a hand, signaling her men to stop. She studied the father, her eyes calculating. You don't want to do this, she said softly, her voice calm, almost soothing. You're out of your depth. The father's grip tightened on the gun, but his expression didn't change. He was a man who had been trained to handle chaos. You won't hurt my son, he said, every word deliberate. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken threats. Then, the woman's smirk returned. This isn't over, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension. You've made an enemy today. Before the father could respond, the masked figures stepped back, retreating into the shadows, leaving the woman standing alone. The boy, still in his wheelchair, could feel the air around them grow heavier, more oppressive. The father didn't lower the gun immediately. His eyes never left the woman, but he was aware of every sound, every shift in the wind. The woman, without another word, turned and walked back toward the waiting SUV. The last thing the father saw was her cold smile before the car doors slammed shut, and the vehicle sped off into the night. The father's grip loosened on the gun as he turned to his son. We need to move, he said, his voice steady, but the weight of the situation hung heavily on both of them. Now, as they continued down the street, the boy felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The woman had made her threat clear. And something told him she wasn't the type to forget a promise. They didn't speak as they turned down another quiet street, the shadows around them growing longer. The boy glanced over at his father, who was scanning every alley and every corner with the practiced caution of a soldier. The boy couldn't quite shake the fear gnawing at him. For the first time, he felt as if they were running from something bigger than just the woman and her men. It was like a storm on the horizon, and they were caught in its path. The father stopped suddenly, his posture stiffening. He turned his head, listening intently. The boy's heart skipped a beat. Something was coming. Before either of them could react, the screech of tires split the air, and a black SUV appeared at the end of the street, its headlights blinding. The boys' blood ran cold as the vehicle slid to a halt in front of them. The doors flung open, and figures stepped out, blocking their path. The storm had arrived. The screeching of tires shattered the night as a black SUV skidded to a halt in front of them. Its headlights sliced through the darkness, cold and blinding. The father immediately pulled his son behind him, instinctively preparing for a confrontation. His hand hovered near his concealed weapon, every muscle tense and ready for action. 3 men emerged from the SUV, tall and imposing. Their faces were masked in shadows, but the way they moved, slow and deliberate, spelled danger. The woman in the car watched them from inside, her silhouette sharp against the glowing dashboard. The boy's heart raced. He wanted to run, but his father's voice cut through his fear. "Stay behind me," he said firmly, his tone steady despite the rising tension. The men circled them, keeping their eyes on the father. The leader, a large figure, stepped forward. "You should have walked away," he said, his voice low and mocking. "But now you'll pay." The father stood his ground. "I'm not walking anywhere," he replied, his voice calm but resolute. "Not until you leave us alone." The man grinned darkly. "You really think you can stop this?" "I'll do what it takes to protect my son," the father answered, the weight of his words settling in the air. The woman's voice broke through the charged silence. "You're not in control anymore," she said softly, her tone cold. "This is where it ends." The father's hand moved towards his weapon, his posture bracing for the inevitable. The situation was spiraling out of control. But he knew he wouldn't back down. Not now. The first man lunged at him. In an instant, the father sidestepped, his fist connecting with the man's jaw. The blow sent him stumbling back. Before the second man could react, the father swept his legs out from under him, bringing him crashing to the ground. His movements were swift, calculated, and efficient. But the third man, the largest of them all, remained standing. He took slow, deliberate steps toward the father, his eyes burning with malice. "Step aside," the man growled. "This doesn't concern you." The father stood firm. "It does now." Without warning, the man charged. The father ducked just in time, avoiding a heavy punch aimed at his face. The man's fist landed on the father's shoulder, sending a jolt of pain through his body. The father grimaced but didn't falter. Using the man's momentum, he twisted his arm behind his back, forcing him to the ground. The boy watched in silence, his heart racing as his father fought with the precision of a trained soldier. Before the father could finish, the woman's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Enough." The men froze. The father didn't lower his guard. His weapon remained in hand, but he knew they hadn't won yet. The woman stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the father. "You think this is over?" she said, her voice icy. "You've only just begun to pay for this." The boy's stomach turned. He didn't understand fully, but he knew this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. The woman's gaze shifted to the boy, her eyes calculating. "You'll regret this," she said softly, her words laced with venom. "You've made an enemy that will haunt you." Then, without another word, she turned and got back into the SUV, followed by the 3 men. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped away into the night. For a moment, the father and son stood in the silence of the street. The boy could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The danger had passed, for now, but the threat still hung in the air. The father exhaled slowly, looking down at his son. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "We're not done." Not by a long shot. The weight of his words settled between them, thick with the promise of what was to come. The storm was far from over. The night felt heavier now, suffocating with the promise of something worse to come. The father and son walked in silence, the boy's hand gripping the wheels of his chair, his mind racing. His father was calm, but the boy could sense the growing weight in his steps. He knew his father well enough to know that the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. They hadn't seen the last of those people. Not by a long shot. "Where are we going, Dad?" the boy finally asked, his voice small, barely a whisper against the overwhelming tension in the air. The father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes on the shadows ahead, watching for movement, anticipating danger. He could feel the weight of his son's gaze, but the silence between them hung like a thick fog. He was trying to calculate the next steps. They couldn't stay here for long. They needed a place to regroup, to prepare. "We need to move quickly," the father finally said, his voice low but firm. "We can't stay on the streets. They'll be coming back soon." The boy nodded silently, sensing his father's urgency. But the fear in the air was tangible. They'd only just escaped the danger, and yet every corner felt like it might hold the next threat. Suddenly, a noise behind them, the sharp crack of a branch snapping. Both froze. The father's body went rigid, his hands slipping under his jacket, fingers brushing the cold steel of his weapon. He didn't turn, didn't give away the fact that he had heard it. He wasn't sure if it was them, but instinct told him they couldn't afford to take any chances. Another step. Closer. The father spun around, his weapon already raised, eyes scanning the dark alley behind them. But it was only a stray dog, its eyes wide with fear, darting across the street and vanishing into the night. The father exhaled, lowering his weapon, but the boy could see the tension in his shoulders. The moment was far from over. The enemy was still out there. "We need to keep moving," the father urged, pushing the boy forward. "This isn't over." They picked up their pace, each step faster, more frantic. The city streets were eerily quiet now, the only sound the distant hum of traffic and the rhythm of their footsteps. But something was off. The air was too still. The father's eyes darted to every shadow, every parked car. They had to be close now. Then, without warning, headlights cut through the darkness again. This time, it wasn't an SUV, but a black sedan, sleek, fast, and unmistakably the same. The boy's stomach dropped, and his heart skipped a beat. "Run!" the father shouted, grabbing the boy's wheelchair and pushing it forward with all his might. But it was too late. The sedan pulled up too quickly, cutting off their path. The door swung open, and the woman emerged again, her cold gaze locking onto the father. The three men were close behind her, their faces twisted in malicious grins. The father didn't hesitate. He shoved the boy behind him, standing tall despite the odds. "I told you," the woman said, her voice silky, dangerous. "You can't run forever. We won't stop until we finish this." "Leave us alone," the father growled, his knuckles white as he gripped his weapon. His fingers twitched, itching for a fight, but he knew he couldn't take them all on. Not like this. Not with his son so close, so vulnerable. The leader of the men took a step forward, cracking his knuckles in anticipation. "You think you can intimidate us with that toy? It's over, old man." The father's expression hardened. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he muttered. His eyes narrowed as he scanned their movements. He could see the slightest shift, a small opening. In one swift motion he moved. He wasn't thinking, just acting on instinct. The first man charged, and the father sidestepped, using the man's own momentum to send him crashing to the ground. A quick strike to the next attacker's ribs, then a spin that brought the third man to his knees. But the leader was still standing, his grin widening. "You're fast," the man sneered. "But you're outnumbered." The father didn't respond. His focus was singular, keeping his son safe. But he could feel the burn in his muscles, the exhaustion starting to set in. His vision blurred slightly from the strain. The leader moved in with terrifying speed, landing a brutal blow to the father's stomach. The wind rushed from his lungs, but the father gritted his teeth and stayed on his feet. He was too stubborn to fall, too determined to back down. Another punch. Another strike. But then, the father's hand found the man's throat, gripping tight. He squeezed with all the strength he had left, the adrenaline rushing through him like a storm. He wasn't going down without a fight. The leader struggled, but his attempts grew weaker. The father's grip tightened, his face grim with determination. The fight was nearly over, but not before he made sure they wouldn't come back. Not before they learned who they were dealing with. With one final shove, the leader collapsed, unconscious on the pavement. The father stood over him, breathing heavily, his body shaking with exhaustion. He looked back at his son. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "It's over," the father said, his voice rough, but firm. "We're safe." But even as he spoke the words, he knew the battle wasn't truly won. Not yet. Not for good. As they walked away, the father kept his eyes on every shadow, every alley. The storm might have passed for now, but the war was far from over. And no matter how far they ran, they would never escape the ones who hunted them.